Okay, so today I want to show you some of my favorite collage inspiration that you may not have heard about. So the standard idea is that collage was invented in around 1912 by the artists Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque in Paris. But around that same time, there was a German artist called Kurt Schwitters who also began making collages. And he called his collages his Merz pictures, which is a made-up term that just described how he just combined these found objects to make pictures, basically. Schwitters was associated with the Dada art movement. So this movement was also kind of a concept that explored abolishing sort of historical conventions and ideas when it came to art making. And it all kind of was churning it around this time in around 1918 because it was a real reaction to the First World War and the void that it opened up in society at that time. So Dada art was a concept and a movement that really widened the Overton window when it came to what art making meant in the 20th century. And in his collages, Schwitters combined. In his collages, Schwitters is so hard to say. In his collages, Schwitters would combine discarded objects, typography, tickets, anything was fair game in his collages. And he was one of the first artists that seriously started using discarded objects that were just found lying around on the street. And this is a quote from Schwitters. "I could see no reason why used tram tickets, bits of driftwood, buttons, and old junk from attics and rubbish heaps could not serve well as materials for paintings. It is possible to cry out using bits of old rubbish, and that's what I did, gluing and nailing them together." And I like how he equates art making with a kind of crying out. It's sort of it's a way of just expressing emotions and feelings that you can't perfectly articulate using words or any other medium. So here I have a book by Isabel Schulz called Kurt Schwitters and his Merz art. And I've just gone through and highlighted some more interesting collages. And I've also found on Wiki Commons, you can actually download pretty high resolution images of his collages. So that is also a really good resource if you just want to examine them in terms of color and construction. So you can see that his sense of design was pretty intuitive, but even though he was using all of these different objects, they really come together in a cohesive design in his collages. So he made a lot of these collages, and you can see in some of them he actually took pieces of wood. So he started with using flat paper, but then he developed it into using found objects like bits of wood. This looks like a part of a mushroom. And gradually, this obsession with collages took on more and more 3 dimensions until finally in his last years, he would actually build these, right here, he would build these constructions that were basically 3D collages that you could walk in and inhabit as a space. And I mean, collage already is a little bit obsessive, and he took it to new levels when he was actually building basically a 3D walk-in collage. So a super interesting artist. I think I have a picture. That is a portrait of Kurt Schwitters there. Kurt Schwitters is one of my favorite collage artists, and he made over 2,000 collages in his lifetime. I find his collages to be very interesting in both design and color. He was one of the first artists to take discarded objects and combine them, which elevates and highlights these discarded materials. He had a great color sense, and his compositions are layered and dynamic and intuitive. He took his instinctive sense of form and color and created new images out of these found objects and created whole new worlds and ways of seeing with them. The work of Schwitters inspired me to use everyday paper in my collages. I use envelopes, wrapping paper, basically anything that I can find that has great color and texture. Being inventive with materials is a solid approach to art, and you don't need the most expensive materials to make something. Another inspiration for me is the English artist Mary Delany. I guess she's British. Would she be British? Yes. Another inspiration for me is the British artist Mary Delany, whose work I stumbled upon totally by accident. Being interested in all things paper, I came across this fascinating book by Molly Peacock called The Paper Garden. It describes the life of Mary Delany and how she became a dedicated collage artist at the advanced age of 72. Though it's said that collage originated from the Cubists, I discovered that Mary Delany was gluing painted paper, making amazing floral pictures in the 1700s, which was over 100 years before Picasso, Braque, and Schwitters. In reading this book, I discovered that in her youth, Mary Delany always had an artistic bent, and she would often entertain people by cutting out silhouettes out of paper, which was quite a popular form of art practice in the 1700s. And you can see by these silhouettes and the detail that she was always very talented in terms of like cutting out shapes and working with tiny little bits of paper. But later in life, she discovered her collage addiction when she saw a geranium petal that had fallen on the surface of a dark table. She happened to have a similarly colored piece of red paper nearby, and so she took out her embroidery scissors and she started cutting out similar shapes with the red paper. And she saw her intricate collages, which she termed her mosaics, as a way to imitate and to preserve the beauty of fresh cut flowers. Oh, and this is her first collage here. So there is her scarlet geranium, and it said that it's her first essay. So this was presumably her first collage, and you can see the shape of the geranium here. So these are the tools that Mary Delany used. So we have a bone folder, a pair of embroidery scissors, a bodkin, and a tweezer. And a bodkin is just basically a tool that you use to poke holes into paper. She would cut up the colored paper, wallpaper remnants, or rag paper that she painted with watercolor to create the exact right color for whatever flower part that she was trying to depict. So the embroidery scissors, they're quite small and sharp, which explains why her collages are quite precisely detailed. And she sometimes assembled her collages by cutting and assembling hundreds of these tiny little bits of paper. And there is a quote that I have from one of her letters where she would use the tiniest dots, squiggles, scoops, moons, slivers, islands, and loops of brightly colored paper. And I love that quote too, just in terms of how she saw her shapes. They were just very dynamic and alive almost. Along with the use of paper, she also sometimes added actual plant parts to her compositions. So not only are her floral arrangements beautifully designed, but they're also botanically accurate, and they're the same size and proportion of the real life specimens. So here is a look at some of her beautiful collages. And here is a example of where you could see that she actually put a real leaf onto her collage. In the same way that Kurt Schwitters did too. There's an example of a Schwitters collage where he actually, I mean, he uses a mushroom here, but he also used, in this collage, for example, you can actually see he's glued a feather right onto his collage. Using the natural objects with the man-made objects creates a really interesting juxtaposition. It creates a really interesting juxtaposition between what is natural and then what is man-made, and what's natural and what is artificial. So here is another image of hers. This is called the Rosa Gallica, the damask rose, and a poppy. It's so striking to see these beautiful colors on a black background. The effect is so graphic and powerful in so many ways. I do like using dark colors, the contrast between the dark and the white colors. I think the eye just loves contrast. Your eye always naturally goes to whatever is the most high contrast in any composition. And the way that you can just move to use, the way that she uses black to define this negative space, I find is really interesting. Even the shape of the black background is just an interesting graphic in and of itself. So here's another example where she used the actual plant material in part of her collage. I mean, she would be a hero if she could actually cut out all of the little veins of that leaf. So she saved some time and just pasted the actual leaf onto the paper. And here she is in her prime collaging years. Although she started making collages in her 70s, Mary Delany ended up creating almost 1,000, I think it was 985 to be exact, of these botanically correct floral images that are currently housed in the British Museum under a collection known as the Flora Delanica. The Flora Delanica. The Flora Delanica is the most visited works in the Department of Prints and Drawings, where only a small selection are permitted to be studied by appointment only due to the delicacy of these collages. And I really love the graphic quality of her floral compositions, which is heightened by the effect of the black background. You can see that she has such an intuitive sense of design. And although the collages themselves can be quite detailed, they still have an effective graphic simplicity and a real quiet presence. And she's really managed to fix the fleeting beauty of flowers and plants. And they're just essentially just visually stunning as collages. So my third source of collage inspiration is that perennial master Henri Matisse. So although he was already a well-established artist and painter, Matisse started making collages in the later chapters of his life. In his advancing age, he was bedridden from surgery and he didn't have the physical stamina to paint or sculpt. So he began creating his collages, which he called his cutouts, with painted paper and scissors while lying in bed. His setup was really simple. He just used white paper that was painted with gouache and scissors and glue. He used these long tailor scissors, and I have an example of what tailor scissors look like. So tailor scissors are obviously massive. They have a huge long blade, which is really good for cutting out curved shapes because you have a lot of time to move the scissors. So he used these long tailor scissors to cut the paper without drawing a guide directly on the paper itself. The long blades of the scissors allow for longer cutting lengths, which are great for cutting curved shapes, and it also discourages the fussy, detailed cutting. I mean, just look at the difference in size between the embroidery scissors and the tailor scissors. I mean, it's pretty crazy. It's also interesting to me to see how the tools that artists used really influenced the outcome of the work that they produced. And this approach to using these scissors was really insightful for me because it allows the use of the tool to influence the outcome of the shape. So it keeps you from being too fussy and it gets your hand just kind of loose. Using these large unwieldy scissors forces you to leave room for the spontaneity that comes just from working intuitively. And I also use another trick that he used by using both the positive and negative shapes from the cut paper. So this example I've set up here. So imagine you have any kind of given shape here. When you cut a shape out, you're left with the positive and the negative. So here's the negative shape, the shape that's missing, and the positive form. So you can see that when you are using both the positive and negative piece of paper, that it creates a kind of dialogue between the shapes where you see certain forms just echoed between compositions, if that makes any sense. So this is a giant book that I have of Matisse from a retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art. And because he started his collages late, they show up kind of at the end of this book. So here is Matisse in the 50s, and you can see the long scissors that he was using on the painted paper here in the background. I don't know if you can see that. It's pretty interesting. And then he's obviously not in the best health. He's in a wheelchair, but he's just surrounded by cut paper, and you can see how he's just totally immersed in his collages. Very similar to Kurt Schwitters just creating these 3D collage spaces. There is something obsessive about collage, and you just sort of want to, obsessively make them and almost live inside one. So you can see these are just pictures of his living quarters. Let me just move my giant scissors out of the way. So he really surrounded himself with his art. So here is his studio here, and you can just see he's just got colored paper shapes just pinned all over the place, on the walls, every surface. He just basically lived and breathed his compositions. And here are some of the pictures of his collages. These are from a book that he created called Jazz. And there are some more favorites here. So his shapes, they're very biophilic. They're very nature inspired, and his colors are very bold and exciting, except for that collage. So here we go. There's some more. And in this case, he's using a collage technique to help generate ideas for a stained glass window in a chapel. Also, another just great dynamic and graphic sensibility. His colors are just very alive, and the forms are just totally solid. These are the probably most well-known collages that Matisse did, his Blue Nude series. And then also this one, which is called The Snail. And even though he's just using really orthographic color, just shapes that are basically rectangular, very solid, you can really sense the spiral of the snail in this design, and that contrast between a spiral and then these just solid, sort of more orthogonal shapes, I find really interesting in this piece. And that's just the mystery of using shape and color. You can elicit these different feelings and emotions and, ideas of movement just by this juxtaposition or the contrast between using squares to depict circularity. It's just such an interesting way to play with those forms. Okay. And my last source of collage inspiration aren't even technically collages. They're the quilts that were made by a group of women that were living in Alabama in an area known as Gee's Bend. So these quilts are interesting to me because they were just created pretty practically for warmth. But I feel that they approached fabric in a way that is so similar to how I approach collage, because they combined shapes and colors that was totally unconventional and intuitive. They didn't feel restricted to the standard quilting blocks or the traditional quilting methods. They worked with whatever material was available to them, and this was often feed sacks, flour sacks, and other repurposed fabric. And they combined these fabrics into original quilts, which were just really beautiful examples of abstract design. So I've always admired the Gee's Bend quilters, but I've only ever seen their quilts online. So I finally ordered this book online. It was secondhand, and it arrived, and it surprised me because it was actually signed by the authors and ancestors of the women who were making these quilts. So here are some of my favorite quilts from this book. So this is a close-up of one of the quilts, and you can really see the way that they just combined whatever fabric scraps they had, and they just ended up looking just very asymmetrical in a way that was, so interesting to me. So these quilts were just made super intuitively, using whatever fabric that they had available, but making decisions about where to place them that were really artistic and interesting in my opinion anyway. In this quilt, the quilt maker would group all of the dark colors together and the light colors together, and it just created these interesting masses that just are visually just very pleasing. And I even like the pop of this random fabric along the bias edge of the quilt. It just makes for such a dynamic composition. So here are some more examples. And it's interesting too, there are some typical quilting patterns, such as the log cabin design and falling stars, and you can see that there are kind of glimmers of these traditional quilt patterns, but then they just go off and just do their own thing, which I find so refreshing, actually. Even though they were working with repurposed material, the way that they assembled the quilts was very deliberate. You can tell that there was consideration made for how the shapes and the colors would sit together. I love how there is just a cluster of tiny little scraps that were sewn together in the middle of this quilt. And this is kind of also then echoed in the fabric that they chose here for these scraps, because the fabric is also quite a busy pattern. And then you can also see typography in this quilt, because this looked like it was an old sack of some kind. Just so interesting in terms of composition. This quilt here is one of my favorites. The colors here are so soft and subdued, a very, very harmonious grouping of colors of the light blues and the grays. And I love that they used, I think it was denim, because you can see where they took the pockets off of the material, and the shadows of the pockets are still visible on the fabric, and it just makes for such interesting shapes on the quilt. This quilt was made in the 20s. So just so lucky that we still have these quilts to look at today. And the colors are so interesting too. These are just the complementary, the orange and the green. And it just makes the quilt just pop out from the page. They really understood that you needed to use always a color with a little bit of the complement. So again, another gorgeous quilt. You could see a kind of idea of maybe a quilt pattern, but then they just went off and did their own thing, which was so interesting. So this is a great book. I'm so happy that I have a reference now that I can look at, because sometimes looking at your computer for too long is a little counterproductive, if you know what I mean. Another really fascinating composition. And again, like Matisse, using these sort of orthogonal shapes, so a lot of squares and rectangles, but really giving a sense of dynamism and movement to the overall composition. So yeah, I could go on and on with this book, but I would, if you could find this online, I would scoop it up, because it's such an interesting. Here's another quilt you can see with the pockets. Like, look at that quilt. This is a more contemporary quilt. This is 2002. But still so visually interesting. Okay. It's interesting to me that collage as an art form seems so popular now, more than ever before. Maybe it's a result of our collective slide into this digital realm where the ubiquitous computer protocol of copy paste just seems like a go-to reflex. It could also be the fact that we are just surrounded by so much material and informational abundance that we are just trying to grapple with just the abundance of stuff everywhere. With collage, the rearrangement of forms and shapes creates almost a alchemical transmutation where we can arrive at a new way of seeing just by combining existing shapes, colors, and materials. I really enjoy making collages because it's fast and there's a real immediacy to the work. You can just jump right in and start. You don't have to wait for paint to dry. You don't have to wash your brushes out. It's a great way to explore the endless color relationships and just to really see what the effect of different sizes and placement can have on a composition. I've gathered so much inspiration from the artists that I've mentioned here, and I hope I can share some of my enthusiasm with you, because it's almost impossible to create art in a vacuum. The practice of making art is like a long conversation with what has come before, and all we can do as artists is to stay inspired and to do our best. Thanks for watching. Bye. Okay. Let's hope that worked.